Well, I really appreciate all of you coming out today. When I got into town, I took a very long walk. It's such a beautiful day, so I'm shocked that this many of you decided to come indoors. I started off in Brooklyn, New York, with an event with my colleagues, and it was the day before we learned, or the day after, sorry, that we learned that the Reverend Daniel Berrigan had passed away, and he would have been 95 years old this week. And I had the honor of knowing Dan Berrigan and having him as a close friend. And he had a tremendous impact on the person I wanted to be before I had ever written any news articles. And for some people who may not know who Dan Berrigan was, or his brother Philip Berrigan, the history books will say that they were sort of iconic figures of the anti-Vietnam War movement, and that's certainly true, but they were so much more than that. And in a few days, it will be the anniversary of the most famous anti-war action that they organized in May of 1968 in Catonsville, Maryland, where Daniel and Philip Berrigan and 7 others went into a draft board in Catonsville, Maryland, a customs house that was housing the draft files for young men that were going to be drafted and sent to the war in Vietnam, a war where disproportionately the poor and people of color were sent, and the children of the elite largely avoided any deployment. And Phil Berrigan had been a civil rights priest in the South. He was a member of the Josephite Order of the Catholic Church and had been an early freedom rider. And Dan Berrigan, in the 1950s, wrote his first best-selling book, which was not really a political book, and he won a very prestigious poetry prize, and he was a pretty prominent figure within the Catholic community the world over, and his books had already been published in many, many languages around the world. And at that time, there were only a handful of news stations, and anytime something big would happen, it would end up spreading pretty quickly. So the Berrigan brothers and 7 of their friends, all of whom were members of the Catholic laity, some of whom who had spent time in Guatemala and in South Asia and elsewhere, working with the poor, working with victims of state-organized violence. And they went into this customs house and they stole, in full view of the clerks, hundreds of draft files out of the cabinets and poured them into metal wastebaskets. And then they took them to the parking lot in front of the customs house and they piled them up, and they then burned them with homemade napalm that they had manufactured from a recipe that they had found in the U.S. Army's field manual. And Daniel Berrigan wrote a statement on behalf of the Catonsville Nine, and it's a statement I've read many, many times. I basically have it memorized. But there's one line from it that I always remember when we debate about whether or not the United States should be overthrowing governments and the question of civilian deaths in war. And the statement that Daniel Berrigan wrote and then read while the draft files were burning began, "Our apologies, good friends, for the fracture of good order, the burning of paper instead of children." And it's such a, I still, to this moment, when I read it or say it, it gives me chills, because it is one of the truest things that's ever been said about war. That we are taught to believe that the good order involves militarism, that the good order necessitates peace through force, that the good order embraces the principles of 1984 with no sense of the irony that it was a criticism of the police state and of Big Brother. And for these individuals to take that action was such an incredibly powerful symbol of an alternative reality, alternative to what was being done at the Pentagon, to what was being portrayed in the U.S. media. And Dan Berrigan had been very intensely influenced by another Catholic priest, a Trappist monk named Thomas Merton. And Merton was one of the very early voices to write in opposition to the war in Vietnam before there was a mass movement. And Merton was once asked early on, when he was opposing the expanding U.S. involvement in Vietnam, a question that many critics of war are often asked in this country, and that is, well, if you're against this, do you support the other side? So you think Saddam should have stayed in power? You think Assad should stay in power? As though that there is a necessity to embrace another evil in order to oppose the evil that emanates from your own country. And Merton was asked, well, does this mean that you support Ho Chi Minh or the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese, and who do you support? And Merton said, I'm on the side of the people that are being burned. And it was such a profoundly honest, searing statement. I'm on the side of the people that are being burned, that rises above the framework that we're all so often provided with, that we're told this is the acceptable range of debate. Do we bomb with drones or do we send in ground troops? There's no analysis or questioning of the fact that our own policy has helped to destabilize countries that now are hotbeds of terrorism and brutality and genocidal policies. And so, I fear in our current society, in an age when, and I love social media as much as the next person, and I really enjoy Twitter, but if we're just tethered to our devices, if we are just distilling everything we have to say in the world into 140 characters, roughly a sentence and a half, then how are we actually going to confront any of the ills facing our society? There was a profile recently in the New York Times Magazine of a guy named Ben Rhodes, who is one of President Obama's top foreign policy advisors. And Ben Rhodes was waxing poetic and gloating over the fact that the White House is able to manipulate so many journalists because these journalists are 27 years old, they've never been anywhere, and we basically can write their stories for them. And he was bragging about this. But let's be clear about one thing. President Obama is surrounded by people like Ben Rhodes. Having Ben Rhodes decide who's going to bomb next is like going into a frat house, pulling someone away from their beer bong and saying, who do you think we should bomb next? These are frat boys that are somehow deciding the entirety of what's called U.S. national security policy. It is a dangerous clique of young white guys who actually are making these decisions and have the ear of the president. And I cannot for the life of me understand why those are the people that President Obama has basically put in charge of our foreign policy. Ben Rhodes is the epitome of the kind of person you don't want making decisions about who to bomb and who not to bomb around the world. He has no world experience. He has no on-the-ground experience in the Muslim world. And there have been numerous articles about this clique of white 20 and 30-somethings who have the social culture of being frat boys, and somehow they have been put in the most prime positions of authority in the U.S. government. And I encourage everyone to read that profile of Ben Rhodes and ask yourself, do we want this kind of person making decisions about what we are told is our national security policy? I mean, it makes us look insane if you actually are interested in the facts. I think a lot of people believe that there's all of these veteran policy people making these decisions. You read about someone like Ben Rhodes and it should give you trembles for what's going on in the world today and who's making these decisions. I'm going to talk tonight about the U.S. policy of assassination, which President Obama prefers to call targeted killing. But before I do that, I want to just thank our hosts here tonight, and also thank my good friends at Elliott Bay Books, who have, from the first time that I wrote a book, have always extended an invitation for me to come and speak here in Seattle, and it's a real honor to do so. And I also want to recognize the parents of one of my colleagues who worked very, very hard on this book, Tom and Leslie Jones, who are here tonight. Their daughter, Andrea, is a friend of mine, but also is an editor at The Intercept, and she's one of the hardest working journalists that I know. Not everyone is as manic as I am, where I regularly sleep in the office, but their daughter has no trouble pulling an all-nighter if she believes that what we're doing is going to mean something to people. And so, they're local here, and they came tonight, and I just wanted to recognize them and thank them for giving the world their daughter, Andrea. We're gathering at a moment in an election year when the three remaining candidates for president of the major political parties, all three of them support the kill list. Yes, Bernie Sanders also supports the kill list. All three of them are totally fine with drone warfare around the world. Now we can spend a lot of time talking about all of the ills of and dangers of a Trump presidency, and I'm perfectly happy to do that and be there with everyone in doing that, but that's low-hanging fruit. Donald Trump is expressing overtly fascist sentiments, but he didn't bring fascism to this country in an overt way. What he did was he brought it to the public light and revealed that there is a sizable minority, but it is sizable, of people in this country that actually hold fascist, bigoted beliefs as core values. And there's an analysis that we could do, many analyses of why that is. But Trump didn't create this phenomenon. Trump merely brought it to the public light and gave voice to people who felt like they were the white silenced majority in this country. And so when we look at the dangers of who Donald Trump is, to just simply focus on stop Trump, or Trump as the man, or Trump as the candidate, ignores the fact that we have hardcore neo-Ku Klux Klan members in our midst in this country, and they don't wear hoods anymore, but they certainly are showing up to vote for someone who is espousing the views that they felt like they weren't allowed to proclaim publicly in our society. But so too is it easy to go after Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is the empire candidate. Hillary Clinton is a part of the permanent deep state. Hillary Clinton is someone who is now getting endorsements from the leading neocons. I will not be surprised, and I'm not saying this facetiously, I'm saying this as an actual prediction. I would not be surprised if the organ of the neocon movement, the Weekly Standard, officially comes out and endorses Hillary Clinton for president. That's not a joke. I'm not being flip. I'm telling you, I think that is a very real possibility. Why do I believe that? Because William Kristol, who is one of the brainchilds of the modern neocon, brainchildren of the modern neocon movement, William Kristol has been tweeting and speaking publicly in praise of Hillary Clinton and saying that she really is the only person that can keep the steady course of the empire. Max Boot, who's another very prominent neocon who has never met a war that he didn't love for other people's children to fight in, also has been publicly advocating for Hillary Clinton. In fact, members of the Republican leadership are going to come out and endorse Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton is largely the beneficiary of Republican craziness when it comes to very real scandals. Her email server issue is a real problem. This is not nothing. When Bernie Sanders said the American people don't give a damn about your emails, I cringed because we should actually give a damn about it. Why? Hillary Clinton's husband is the head of a parallel, almost government called the Clinton Global Initiative. They set up this private server in their bathroom at their mansion north of New York City, not for convenience, but so that they could operate a parallel government where Bill is raising billions of dollars around the world, while his wife was simultaneously acting as the top diplomat for the United States government, often meeting with world leaders who Bill was trying to get money from. There is a scandal there. But there's also a scandal in the fact that Hillary Clinton was receiving classified information on her emails, but she plays with words. And her campaign people are so smart in how they spin the media. They say she never received any classified documents. And when they say that, they know that most people have no idea what that means. Sounds reasonable. She never received any classified documents. Yes, we don't like the fact that the Secretary of State had a private email, but what's the big harm? Well, that's not how classification works. When a document is created in the form of an email, it becomes classified based on what's in it. The very creation of an email, hitting the to box in an email and putting an address in there does not make it classified. But when someone then emails information about what's happening on the ground in a country where the United States has intelligence personnel or military operations, then it needs to be reviewed to determine if it should be classified, and if so, at what level. She received thousands of emails that dealt with very sensitive U.S. policy positions and ongoing operations, and is trying to say, well, none of those were classified. Of course they weren't classified because you didn't subject them to anyone to review for classification. That's not how it works. So they're all playing with words there. And I raise this about Hillary Clinton for this reason. This administration has waged a war against whistleblowers. President Obama has utilized the Espionage Act, his Justice Department has utilized the Espionage Act more than every single president in history combined since it was first passed in 1917. And if you know anything about the Espionage Act, you know that the intent, the public intent of that bill that was then signed into law was to try to target individuals who were believed to be collaborating with foreign powers in the context of World War I. But its actual use and the intent of it was to target leftists who were perceived to be enemies of the established U.S. state. And you fast forward then to the present, and Obama is using it to go after a wide range of people who provided journalists or the public with information that the government was withholding, including information that revealed unconstitutional activities like spying on American citizens and collecting their metadata in direct contravention of the spirit of the laws that Congress thought that they had enacted. Chelsea Manning is doing 30 years in a military prison. And regardless of what you think of WikiLeaks or what Chelsea Manning did, I hope that everyone, if you only are going to look at one thing, look at the video that was called the collateral murder video that Chelsea Manning provided to WikiLeaks. And what you will see on that video is U.S. military personnel gunning down Iraqi civilians and 2 Reuters journalists, and then circling around and attacking the first responders who tried to pull their bodies away from the gunfire. That was crystal clear evidence of a war crime that was exposed because of a low-ranking military individual who decided to blow the whistle. The treatment of Edward Snowden, the fact that he's in exile right now, the U.S. likes to make much of the fact that he's in Moscow, and they act as though Edward Snowden intended to go to Moscow. But if you actually follow the story, if you know the facts, then you know that the U.S. was the entity that put him in Moscow, because he was flying through Russia as a gateway to go to Latin America, where he had been negotiating asylum with a number of countries. And while he was in the air, the United States canceled his passport. And so when he entered Russia, he didn't have a valid passport, and the Russians wouldn't let him leave the airport. And he still doesn't have a valid passport. So that's why he was stuck in Russia. He didn't go there with any documents that he shared with Russian intelligence. That's all propaganda. You know, I mean, I now know Edward Snowden personally. I don't agree with him on everything. He's a pretty hardcore libertarian. But I think the general principles upon which he based his decision to do this are very sound, and they are moral at their core. And I totally support amnesty for Edward Snowden. And I totally believe that Chelsea Manning should be freed from that military prison, particularly if David Petraeus is somehow considered an acceptable member of our society when he leaked classified information and shared classified information with a woman that he wanted to look like Superman in front of, who happened to not be his wife, but he was sleeping with. You know, you do that and you're fine. You're a member of the club. You can move on. You can get a cushy job at a university, giving 1 lecture a year for 6-figure income. All of these guys fail upwards when they break the law. All of these people then are allowed back on CNN or allowed to go on the distinguished lecture circuit. But Chelsea Manning has to do 30 years in prison. Thomas Drake, who blew the whistle internally at the NSA before ever going to a journalist, tried to do what they say Snowden should have done, tried to go up the chain of command. When he did that, when he reported what he considered to be abuses being committed by the NSA, and this was a guy who spent 27 years working for the U.S. government. He was not a low-level 20-something. He had been in the Air Force, and then he was at the NSA. When Thomas Drake went through the system and blew the whistle, his house was raided. His reputation was smeared. And Thomas Drake now works at an Apple store in Virginia, making slightly above minimum wage. He was a guy who spent 3 decades of his life working on behalf of the United States government, and his crime that he committed was not going and holding a press conference or giving Julian Assange documents. It was blowing the whistle internally. The same thing happened to Bill Binney, another NSA whistleblower. He blew the whistle internally. His house got raided while he was in the shower, and they pulled him out naked and handcuffed him. And then they smeared Bill Binney. This is what they do to people who are leaking information with any kind of a moral code informing it. But when you leak it to make yourself look like a hero to your mistress, or when you leak it like John Brennan did after the operation in Abbottabad that killed Osama bin Laden, John Brennan blatantly lied to journalists for days on end, making up bullshit like bin Laden, there was an intense firefight. Bin Laden put one of his wives in front of him. It was all not true. And then a few days later, the White House said, oh, actually, we were mistaken about those things. But no one ever pays attention to that. The original story is what sticks. And they knew what they were doing. It was a well-managed information operation. They knew what they were doing, and they knew that the overwhelming majority of journalists in the Washington Press Corps would just eat it up. And so there's never a penalty for those kind of leakers. There's a difference between whistleblowers and leakers. Whistleblowers go to jail, and leakers go to Yale. And the blowers are heroes, and the whistleblowers are criminals. So you can have the current head of the CIA blatantly lie to the media to try to make one of the most sensitive operations in U.S. military history seem like this Captain America movie. And there's no consequences for him. He'll be just fine. But low-ranking people who blow the whistle, they're going to go to jail. The documents that we published in this book represent the first time that the American public has had a chance to see raw documents on how the drone program functions, to see what the actual kill chain looks like, which officials are involved with deciding who's going to live and die around the world on any given day. One of the charts that we published shows that Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, was signing off on every single person who was assassinated in a drone strike. But we're too busy analyzing Donald Trump's taco bowl to ask any real questions in this election season about the role of Hillary Clinton in any of this stuff, about her role in regime change in Libya that directly led to the death of our ambassador there, Chris Stevens. You know, the Benghazi committee, Hillary Clinton is so lucky that the most batshit crazy people in the U.S. are running that committee, because they are never asking a real question. They've made it into a partisan witch hunt. And Hillary's right when she says it's a partisan witch hunt. She's right because they're not asking the real question, which is that your policy led to the destabilization of this country. Your policy of covert action that killed important tribal figures in Benghazi resulted in the raid on our annex and the consulate there. This had nothing to do with a video of the Prophet Muhammad. This was that they were running covert CIA, special operations forces, targeted killing operations, and they killed the wrong people. They killed people that were connected to powerful tribes, and those tribes attacked the consulate and the annex in retaliation from a hit program that John Brennan was running inside of Benghazi. But you will never hear Hillary Clinton asked about that. You'll only see the fictitious movies, 13 Hours in Benghazi, Zero Dark 30. That's how history now is told in our country. So we don't ever have to ask questions of someone that very well may be the next commander-in-chief and the next president, because we're too busy dealing with what Donald Trump was eating, and then guffaws at Hillary Clinton when someone accidentally almost says God, and God we trust at Hillary Clinton's rally. That's the big story today in right-wing media, that someone almost was going to mention God at a Hillary Clinton rally, and then they stopped themselves, and that's proof that Hillary is the Antichrist. So I mean, that's the nature of the discourse here. But these documents that we're publishing in this book are the only primary documents that have ever been released on the drone program, how it works, how they determine who is a civilian and who is not a civilian. One of the most damning pieces in this, which was written by my colleague Ryan Devereaux, shows that in one period that the military studied about assassination operations, that 9 out of the 10 people that the special operations forces were killing in mostly drone strikes, 9 out of those 10 people were not the intended target of the strikes. Now that doesn't mean that they were all civilians. It means that they don't know who they were, but they then label them as EKIA, enemies killed in action. And that remains their designation unless someone posthumously proves that they were not a suspected militant, a term that has no legal definition, that they were not somehow connected to terrorism. If they died alongside what they call in these documents the jackpot, meaning the intended target of the strike, they are preemptively labeled as enemies killed in action unless they are visibly identifiable to the drone operators or others as women and children. And the only way you get that designation off of your corpse in death is if someone, a journalist, a human rights worker, or someone else goes there, investigates it, and proves that this was a botched strike against a wedding party, not a convoy of the Pakistani Taliban or Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. It's like reverse due process, except you're dead. You can't appeal once you've been killed by a drone strike. And to me, that embodies the entire chaotic, out-of-control system that now has the stamp of legitimacy from a constitutional lawyer, Nobel Peace Prize winner, who told us that he was going to operate the most transparent administration in history. Obama has put a stamp of Democratic Party legitimacy on policies that were dreamt up by Dick Cheney, not when he was in the White House this time, but going all the way back to the Ford administration. Rumsfeld was the youngest defense secretary and the oldest defense secretary. This was a lifelong project of Rumsfeld and Cheney to achieve what they viewed as a necessary dictatorship of the executive branch of the United States government when it came to war policy, when it came to national security policy. And if you actually pay very close attention to what Obama says about the legal authorities to run this program, he's not relying on the 2001 authorization for the use of military force, which was passed in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. Only one member of either House of Congress voted against it, Representative Barbara Lee of California. Every young person in this country, well, all of us really, but I really think young people in this country should go on YouTube later and watch Barbara Lee's speech when she rose to oppose, 4 days after 9/11, rose to oppose that bill that was signed into law. She was trembling. She was getting death threats. Every word she said when she stood to oppose that bill ended up being prophetic about what would happen if we gave these authorities to the Bush-Cheney administration. And President Obama campaigned on the idea that he was going to roll back the excesses, the abuses of that era. And on some issues he did do that, but on the most core issues involving assassination, the drone program, he pushed it farther than John McCain or Mitt Romney ever would have been able to, because he got liberals to join in on it. He got liberals to learn to love the idea of assassination and covert war and drones. At the height of the drone wars, 2011 to 2013, some polls indicated that 70% of self-identified liberals supported the U.S. Conducting of drone strikes. And support for those strikes only dropped negligibly when it was an American citizen who was the target, even if they had never been charged with a crime or had never been indicted of a crime. That was entirely due to who Obama is. That has nothing to do with whether liberals actually think that's a good idea. They were sold a bill of goods by their guy when he was in office, as though there's a such thing as a Democratic or a Republican cruise missile, or a Democratic or a Republican drone strike. There's no partisanship when it comes to these operations, and there's not going to be selective targeting of the politicians who implemented these policies when blowback comes. There's going to be attacks against any Americans that they can lay their hands on, and the people that want to retaliate as a result of their loved ones being killed won't necessarily be terrorists. They're people that are like all of us in this room who when confronted with the extrajudicial killing of one of our relatives, probably will have an instinct that we want something done to those people. Now, I'm against the death penalty, but the people that I admire most and that I respect most who are opposed to the death penalty are people who are from an organization called Murder Victims' Families for Reconciliation. People whose own loved ones were killed, including women whose teenage daughters were raped and murdered, who then opposed the death penalty for their child's rapist and killer. The reason I bring that up is because I think most people's gut instinct is not to do that. Those are extraordinary people. Most people will want revenge. That's what happened after 9/11. It seems to have been a natural instinct. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not making a moral judgment about it. I'm saying that's just reality. So we can't choose the response to policies that we support or allow to be enacted around the world that end up killing innocent people. We don't determine what the response to those deaths of civilians are going to look like. Now, to publish documents like this requires someone from within the state to provide them. And someone who would provide these will certainly know that the odds are that they will be charged with espionage, and that they will be arrested, and that they will be prosecuted. And yet we had an incredibly brave whistleblower who worked on the assassination program that provided us with these documents. And I want to just share with you briefly an essay that the source for this book, for many of the documents in this book, provided to us. And I should just say before I read this brief section that this individual also provided us with what was called the watch listing guidance in 2013. It was the government's secret rule book for placing people on the watch list, on the terror watch list, on the no-fly list. And we published that 188-page rule book, and the government freaked out when we were doing that, and then they tried to run to a journalist from a corporate media outlet to give them the story before we could publish it so that they could put a spin on it. But we were able to get it out. And it sparked lawsuits across the country, including in federal court in Oregon, where a judge ruled the watch listing process unconstitutional because American citizens don't have a right to understand how they've been put on the list or even if they're on the list. So already the source of these documents had a direct impact on some of the litigation being brought forth to try to challenge the watch listing project. So this is the essay of our source. Over the past few years, we've heard a lot about President Obama's secret kill list. Yet still, we know virtually nothing about its implementation. Despite mild congressional scrutiny and ACLU lawsuits directed at the shroud of secrecy, some basic questions remain unanswered. How do you get on the list? Am I on the list? Who put me on the list? How do you get off the list? Can you get off the list? The truth is there are several such lists used to target individuals for different reasons. Some lists are closely kept, others span multiple intelligence and local law enforcement agencies. There are lists used to kill or capture supposed high-value targets, and others are intended to threaten, coerce, or simply monitor a person's activity. However, all the lists, whether to kill or to silence, originate from the terrorist identities data mart environment, and they are maintained by the Terrorist Screening Center at the National Counterterrorism Center. The existence of TIDE is unclassified, yet details about how it functions in our government are completely unknown to the public. In August of 2013, the database reached a milestone of 1 million entries. Today, it's thousands of entries larger and is growing faster than it has since its inception in 2003. The March 2013 watch listing guidance lays out the broad criteria for nominating someone to the database. Not only does the Terrorist Screening Center reserve the right to store your name, date of birth, and other basic identifying information, but it also stores your medical records, transcripts and passport data, your license plate numbers, email and cell phone number, along with the phone's international mobile subscriber identity and international mobile station equipment identity numbers, your bank account numbers and purchases, and other sensitive information, including DNA and photographs capable of identifying you using facial recognition software. The National Counterterrorism Center collaborates annually with agencies from the international alliance known as Five Eyes to supplement any information missing from entries already in its database, or to add more entries. Individual entries in the database are assigned a TIDE personnel number, or TPN. From Osama bin Laden, TPN 1063599, to Abdulrahman al-Awlaki, TPN 26350617, the American son of Anwar al-Awlaki. Anyone who has ever been the target of a covert operation was first assigned a TPN and closely monitored by all agencies who follow that TPN long before they were eventually put on a separate list and extrajudicially sentenced to death. When governments begin to tally enormous enemies lists, they run roughshod over our essential checks on power, especially when they consider their own citizens to be a threat. Of the more than 1 million entries in the TIDE database, approximately 21,000 are those of American citizens. By leaking this information, I hope to give the public an opportunity to know what kind of activity might lead to their being placed on a list used to monitor their everyday activity. For the first time, the public has an opportunity to gain insight into the criteria that could potentially lead to their own trial by drone strike. In 2008, I shook hands with Senator Obama when he came through my town on his way to the White House. After his inauguration, he said, quote, "Transparency and the rule of law will be the touchstones of this presidency," end quote. I firmly believe those principles are crucial to an open society, which is why I was compelled to reveal this information. If this administration lacks the courage to uphold its promises to the people, then I and others like me will do so for them. This is an incredibly brave and principled individual who very well may be charged with espionage. And one thing that I think all of us can do in our everyday lives, everyone always says, well, what can we do about this? If you make it your business to study any number of the whistleblowers that I was mentioning tonight and really get your head around the facts of their case, who they were, why they did what they did, and then what happened to them as a result of it, and you drop that into conversations with people that generally don't want to come to things like this with you, and you start to raise this in discussion with people, you already are doing something. Because one of the most horrifying aspects of what happened to Chelsea Manning, after leaking hundreds of thousands of documents that were then used by newspapers across the world to sell papers and gain viewers and win awards, she was completely dropped by all of those papers. The New York Times, which put those documents on the front page of its paper and won many awards, didn't even cover her trial. It was one of the most significant trials in modern American history. And they finally sent a journalist at the very end of the trial because two independent reporters had shamed them into doing so. The same was true of CNN, and then they sent a producer and a camera person there, and the great independent journalist Alexa O'Brien began live tweeting the CNN producer's naps every day in the courtroom. Wasn't even paying attention to what was happening in the court. In fact, when the military put Chelsea Manning on trial, the judge said there will be no transcripts of this hearing. And so we joined with a handful of other news organizations and sued them. And we won the right to have the hearings documented. They were going to not even have transcripts of this trial. They said, okay, fine, there will be a transcript, but you have to pay for it. Okay, so we all pitched in and we hired a court transcriber to go there. Why is it that it's underpaid independent journalists that have to shame the paper of record in this country to covering the trial of a whistleblower whose documents they put on their front page? It tells you a lot about the priorities in our society. Chelsea Manning is in that prison and no one cares. How many people have ever discussed the WikiLeaks documents, the State Department cables, any of those things, who are aware that Chelsea Manning is languishing alone in a military prison with a 30-year sentence hanging over her head? So we all can do something, no matter what you do in your ordinary life. I would say one of the most important things you could do to fight for transparency and any respect of a democratic process is to raise the stories of those people who took the risks to provide us with information that should have been provided by the state in order to encourage an informed debate in our country about life and death policies. The fact that we are going to have the next president of the United States carrying on this legacy, expanding this program, should be of grave concern to all of us. How many of you are aware that there's an executive order that was issued under Gerald Ford saying that the United States does not engage in assassinations? Have people heard of that? Anyone? Okay. So in the 1950s, the United States, and this is why we called this the assassination complex, in the 1950s, when the CIA was officially created as its own entity, there had been other entities that were conducting the same types of operations, but one of the first things the CIA did was to overthrow the democratically elected government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala. It was a leftist government, popular election. Jacobo Arbenz was overthrown. Then Mossadegh was overthrown in Iran. And then you had support for all of these military juntas in Central and Latin America and the support of the Pinochet regime. And then there were political assassinations inside the United States. John F. Kennedy was killed. Bobby Kennedy was killed. Martin Luther King was killed. Malcolm X was killed. Fred Hampton was killed. Some of them were killed by people with connections to U.S. intelligence. Some were killed by the Chicago Police Department, as in the case of Fred Hampton, and others, we don't know who killed them. But there were so many political assassinations happening that Congress finally said, well, we're going to investigate this. But they didn't really investigate the whole program. They took on a few issues, and they had the Church Committee, and then they had the House Committee on Political Assassinations. And what ended up happening as a result of that was that you had some people saying, well, we need to shut the CIA down. Well, that wasn't going to happen. Nixon had been, had resigned. Ford was coming in as president. Cheney and Rumsfeld were two of his top guys. Both of them were obsessed with one of the Federalist Papers called on the unitary executive, the idea of the dictatorship of the executive branch. And they came up with this idea, well, if Congress legislates this issue, that's going to cause problems. We don't want the term assassination to be defined under U.S. law. We don't want to have rules put in place that will limit the executive branch's ability to wage war. So they came up with this idea that Ford would issue an executive order stating that the United States will not engage in political assassinations. Then when Jimmy Carter became president, Carter amended it. And he removed the word political, and it was just said assassinations. And then Carter added anyone acting on behalf of the United States, contractors or agents, also is prohibited from engaging in assassination. Reagan upheld that order. George H.W. Bush upheld that order. Clinton upheld that order. George W. Bush upheld that order, and President Obama upheld that order. And every single one of those people has explicitly violated that order. Why? Because Congress not only has never done this, has never said this is what assassination is, and this is our legislative interpretation of this executive order, which really is kind of an extrajudicial edict. It's like something an emperor would do. The court prefers we don't assassinate, but it's not. It has no teeth. So Congress not only hasn't done it, but has stealthily refused to do it. And it has happened, when a member of Congress says, well, why don't we do this? The full weight of both political parties comes down on them, and they stomp it out. So it's never happened. And after 9/11, Richard Clarke, who was Clinton's what they called counterterrorism czar, was called in front of a joint hearing of the Democratic and Republican leadership of both houses, as well as the intelligence committees of both houses. And Nancy Pelosi was one of the chairs of this hearing. The transcripts of that were declassified a few years ago, although they're heavily redacted. I wrote about this in my previous book, Dirty Wars, but it is such a telling tale about where we are right now. The point of that hearing from the Republican perspective was to try to put the blame for 9/11 on Bill Clinton. And they were trying to say, well, Clinton could have killed bin Laden and he never did it. And this wasn't just Bush's people missing the signs. It was Clinton that really did this. So that was part of why the Republicans wanted Richard Clarke there. And then the Democrats wanted Richard Clarke there because they wanted to figure out a way to justify what was coming, the gloves coming off, the torture, the secret prisons, etc. But Clarke said some interesting things in that hearing. He said that they had contemplated killing Osama bin Laden, and that they wanted to do it in a Tomahawk cruise missile strike on a farm in Afghanistan where they believed bin Laden was residing. But they said that the lawyers on the National Security Council and from the CIA and from the military were all concerned that if they did that, it would violate the executive order on assassination, which is kind of macabre and hilarious at the same time, that it would violate it, and that any personnel that would have participated in it could have been indicted under international law or charged with war crimes. And so they were very, very conservative in authorizing any of those so-called targeted strikes against bin Laden. They did ultimately authorize some of them, but nothing like what we see today, where we're bumping people off left and right around the world. But what Clarke said in that hearing was that the overall sentiment in the Clinton White House at that time, and the reason we didn't just run to the races with this idea that we can bump off bin Laden, was we didn't want to give the world the impression that we were running an Israeli-style assassination program. That is what we're doing today. We are doing what the Israelis have long done, but we're doing it on a global scale. And the U.S. is sending a message to Russia and China and the other 75 nations that have weaponized drones that this is acceptable. When the most powerful nation in the world says there's no such thing as international law, refuses to support an international criminal court that would have jurisdiction over the powerful, wields its veto power at the UN, when that country says, well, we can bump off anyone in any country at any time we choose, that sends a message that that's acceptable on the international stage. So the stakes for us are very, very high in this country. We have, just by the fluke of our citizenship or where we were born or where we reside, have a much greater burden than many people around the globe. We have the burden of living in the empire, of living in the most powerful nation on earth. And for us to decide that we just want to sort of veg out and let it be on cruise control, or check our conscience at the door of every 4 years election, it means that we're part of this problem. If we don't start paying attention to what's being done in our name around the world, if we don't take a real interest in it, if we don't defend the people that blow the whistle on it, if we don't have the time of day to get away from our machines and our computers and our daily grind life to do a little something to try to raise these questions in society, then we're a major part of the problem. The moment you cede any portion of your conscience to a politician is the moment you stop participating in a struggle for any kind of democratic values. Bernie Sanders supported regime change in Iraq. Bernie Sanders voted for the Iraq Liberation Act in 1998, which was authored by the neocons. Bernie Sanders supported the sanctions on Iraq. Bernie Sanders supported the longest sustained bombing campaign since Vietnam under Bill Clinton in Iraq, bombing Iraq every 3 days, saying we're protecting the Shia and we're protecting the Kurds. They ended up killing more Shia and Kurds than any of Saddam's people in those bombings. And then he says, well, Hillary Clinton loves regime change. Okay, Bernie, I agree with you on that. But what's your answer about your record in supporting regime change in Iraq before it became cool among the Republicans? You were there vocally supporting that. Now, that's not the same as voting for the invasion of Iraq, but the invasion of Iraq couldn't have happened on a legislative level had they not passed that bill in 1998 that codified regime change as the law of the land. Now, some people, blast anyone who criticizes their particular messiah. Hillary's people are very vicious on social media and come after you, and anyone who criticizes Hillary Clinton becomes a sexist immediately. Bernie bros, all this stuff. But then also, when you criticize Bernie Sanders, it's like you've dropped a stink bomb in a room, like you've done some vile act by pointing out facts. Journalists are supposed to present information with no regard to who the politician is. We're supposed to hold those in power accountable, whether they're Bernie Sanders or George W. Bush or Dick Cheney. Our job isn't to be partisan warriors for any particular cause. And if we're not a grown-up enough society to deal with the facts and realize that our messiahs are actually not messiahs, then what business do we have calling ourselves a democracy or a democratic republic? We don't have any business doing that. So I think all of us have to sort of, myself included, we all have to kind of take a humility pill about where we are in this country, the state of empire, our impact on the world, the perception of our country, because of all of these wars, because the Nobel Prize winner and the cartoonish villain Cheney somehow ended up on the same page of history when it came to legitimizing and normalizing assassination as a central component of our national identity, not just our national security policy, but our national identity. We have become a nation of assassins because we don't say anything about it. We veg out, watch Rachel Maddow makes us all feel good. Bernie Sanders, oh yeah, we're part of the revolution. That stuff is plastic. What's real is actually assessing who you are in the country you live in and what you're doing to try to change it or alter that path. It's a challenge I think all of us need to own and embrace in this country on a regular basis. So with that, I'll stop, and I'm happy to answer any questions or hear any comments. So thank you all very much for being here. Are you Phil Donahue now?
No, but it's good to have your question here so that the folks at KEXP will hear your question.
Yeah. First, what you've done since your books 9 and 10 years ago is extraordinary and extraordinarily brave. But as you're saying, the whistleblowers are in danger, being imprisoned, being smeared, being put through things that should never happen in a legitimate democracy. What about your revealing what they are giving you? Are you in any, I don't want to even put quotes around it, are you in any danger as far as your work is concerned, your physical being is concerned? They can't destroy your reputation for those of us who know you. But what is your situation?
You don't give them enough credit. They can destroy anyone's reputation. But,
yeah, I'm being a little facetious.
Yeah, no.
But what is your situation as far as all of that is concerned?
I appreciate the sentiment, and it seems like very sincere concern you have. But I get uncomfortable when asked that kind of question for one main reason, but also other sub reasons. I recently was very honored to receive an award from the the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, their archive in New York. And my co-recipient of that award was the 80th anniversary of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And for people that don't know, this was roughly 3,000 Americans who, before World War II began in earnest, had traveled to Spain, where General Franco was building up a fascist regime, and it really was considered at the time the front line of the struggle to defeat fascism. And some 3,000 young Americans went to Spain, and they became known as the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, and they lost. And it wasn't just the Americans. There were brigades from all over the world that came, anarchists, communists, trade unionists. It wasn't just anyone from a particular ideology. It was a lot of working class people from around the world went to Spain because they viewed it as, on the one hand, a protection of the rights of workers, but on the other hand, a victory that needed to happen or else fascism would spread. And anyway, I won't get into the whole history of it, but if you had never heard of the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, it's really something you should read about. Some of the most extraordinary stories in our country's history, and there really isn't. The last of the living veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, Delmar Bergman, just died a few months ago. But my co-recipient of that award was a Mexican journalist named Lydia Cacho, who is an extremely famous journalist in Mexico. She's written 13 books. She is a very brave investigative journalist who has taken on the narco cartels, taken on the president of Mexico through multiple presidencies. She was at one point kidnapped and tortured for a month. Record numbers of journalists have been, she has a price on her head, and she still lives in Mexico and still works there. Her books have been published in more than 100 languages around the world, but no Mexican publication will publish her now because they're afraid that their headquarters will be attacked or their editors will be killed. And so I'm with her receiving this award. And we both were talking about the fact that we know so many of our friends and colleagues have been murdered as journalists. I was counting recently at 13 people, friends of mine, that I have worked with in different capacities over the years have been killed since 9/11 in different war zones. And some of them have been disappeared, and some have been beheaded by ISIS, some have been killed by the United States. But you asked me about sort of my situation, and I feel like we're seeing record numbers of journalists killed in Mexico, in Somalia, in Honduras, in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and almost all of those journalists are unfamous journalists. They're not journalists that have a platform or that anyone in this country knows because they're not reporting, for the most part, in the English language. When Richard Engel was kidnapped for 30 seconds, it became an enormous. And he confessed immediately. Richard Engel gets taken, and he's saying, the United States should pull out of Syria. It's like he had instant Stockholm syndrome. When you have Austin Tice has been missing in Syria for 3 years, but when Richard Engel was taken, it was all over the news. The president issues a statement on it. But when a Turkish journalist gets abducted or killed or beheaded, when a Polish journalist is killed, when local Syrian bloggers are murdered, there's no attention paid to it at all. They're not white enough, and they're not MSNBC enough, and that makes me embarrassed to think about the question that you just asked. Because do journalists doing what we're doing at The Intercept face some degree of risk? We do, but not in the form of someone bumping us off. There is great pushback from powerful institutions, but they're more sophisticated in how they handle people like us. And the real way that they target journalists now is not to get you audited or to engage in a whisper campaign against you, although they do some of that. It's to go after the people that talk to you in government and make it so that you're viewed as a toxic individual and that they will be committing a crime merely by speaking to you. So I think there's a global war on journalism, but in many countries it is literally a war where journalists are being killed. And here it is more a war against those who would dare to provide unsanctioned information about the activities of the government. So, but I thank you for your question. Yes, sir.
So, I really admire you and respect you, and I'm sure you've heard this question an infinite number of times. And I suspect Obama, Cheney, whoever would say, look, bad things have happened, but if we hadn't done these things, Americans would have died, et cetera, et cetera. It's very similar to the Hiroshima thing just in the news, where they said, yes, 200,000 Japanese died, but if we hadn't done that, 2 million Americans would have died invading Japan. Well, 2 million is probably an exaggeration. Okay, we'll admit that, but a lot would have died, and we were just not in a position where we could ignore that possibility. And ultimately, if we hadn't done these things, bad things would have happened. And the truth is, because of our positions, we know, and you can't know. I mean, I don't know, in a way, there's no way you can answer that argument. But how would you respond to something like that?
Well, I mean, first of all, there have been several scholarly investigations of the conditions leading up to the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I completely reject the idea that those bombings somehow were necessary or resulted in the... No, I know they say it, but I would reject that, and I think that there's a tremendous amount now of scholarship that the ashes have settled. But their argument, I mean, it's a classic argument that they make, which is that sometimes you have to kill civilians in order to keep the country safe because you're taking out the bad guys, and there's going to be collateral damage in war. Now, and I think that is a widely held belief in this country about what we're doing around the world. But if you only can talk in sound bites, it's very difficult to debate that issue. In order to really answer your question, we have to ask questions like, where did ISIS come from? Why was ISIS able to rise up? Who makes up the military strength of the core of ISIS? The answers to those questions are not simple, and no one's going to want to listen to it. We want, well, Jihad John is chopping heads off. We need, like Donald Trump says, these people chop heads off. We just have to go and kill them all, kill their families. Well, we helped create ISIS through our policies. One thing that they never want to talk about is that there's two parts of ISIS. One is the wacko propaganda wing, and they're very slick and sophisticated videos. And the other is that they have actual military know-how, and they've seized large quantities of American ordnance and armored vehicles in Iraq. Who knows how to operate those things that ISIS has? It's former Baathists from Saddam Hussein's regime, many of whom were trained by the United States in the 1980s, who are senior commanders, military commanders of ISIS. We created the conditions to destroy a secular nation where Saddam Hussein, who is a brutal, murderous dictator, had all of those groups in check because he ruled with an iron fist. When Saddam was overthrown, Iran became the greatest beneficiary of that war. And then jihadist groups from around the region began to gravitate to Iraq. It was like flypaper because you could go there to kill American soldiers. And so if it was just like, well, what do you want to do about ISIS? And you're only allowed 5 words, or you're only allowed a Twitter response or something, you can't talk about it. But to ask that question is like, we've just beaten someone up in a room, and then they say, well, what are you going to do to try to help that person? No, you did it. You beat them up. Get someone else in here to deal with it. That's what happens over and over. But you can't talk about that because it doesn't fit into a little tiny soundbite. So, I would reject the entire framing of that question, if I wanted to be intellectually honest, and say that you asking that is just an insult to the dead, because you're ignoring the entire context of how we got to that point. You bring up the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I was talking about the Abraham Lincoln Brigade before. Germany came in and bombed the international coalition of young people that had gone to Spain to fight fascism, and the United States did nothing. The United States didn't get involved in World War II until it felt like its economic interests were going to be met. The United States wasn't taking Jewish refugees for the first several years of that war. But now, well, we're not allowed to say anything about that. Tom Hanks may have a movie to make about it. But it is uncouth in our society to embrace any narrative other than the United States defeated Hitler and won World War II. It's rank bullshit. That war could have been stopped from the beginning. But we didn't do it. So all I'm saying is that those questions can't be tied up in a neat little box unless you want to totally ignore the fact that our actions have consequences in the world. So I don't buy this notion that by doing a drone strike, first of all, I don't think we've done a single drone strike that has stopped an imminent plot. I don't think that we have killed one person that was about to board a plane. And the president himself said the standard is that they're going to be engaged in an imminent threat against the United States. But they redefined the word imminent to bear no resemblance to its actual meaning. And we know that because of a Department of Justice white paper that was leaked on the eve of John Brennan's confirmation. So, to even engage, and I have been asked that a million times, and only recently did I start to sort of embrace a principle. I'm going to reject the entire basis of that question, because it's you created a mess, and then you ask me why I'm against you fixing it with a solution that probably is going to cause more problems. It's bullshit. Any women want to ask a question? Yeah. But can we get, okay, but I just want to have some gender balance. Yeah, we'll go to her and then you. Yeah. It's just men tend to dominate these things. And
Got it. Who over here? Oh, there.
Yeah.
It's a little bit related to that question, but I wondered if you had any insight as to why Obama is doing the bidding of Rumsfeld and Cheney. And I'm wondering if you have insights into what's going on in the rooms. Is he having too many security briefings in which he's scared and feels that he has to do this, or people will die, or what's the nuance?
Well, I mean,
there?
first of all, I think that I would draw a great distinction between who Barack Obama is and who Dick Cheney is. I mean, I actually do think that Dick Cheney is like Dr. Evil in The Lair. I mean, I think of him as like sitting there in a cave somewhere, really plotting on how he can just fuck the world. And then Obama, I think is more. Sorry, I know you're horrified at my language. And then Obama. But I think Obama is much more thoughtful, and I think that what's powerful about what's happened is that I think he's come to believe that this actually is the least bad way to do all of this. And this is not a very sexy answer, but I think it is to my knowledge, I think it's the accurate one. When you run for president and you secure the nomination of one of the two major parties, you then are briefed. You're given a classified briefing by not only the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, but by other senior intelligence and military officials. And when Obama beat Hillary Clinton in the 2008 election and got the nomination, he was briefed by General Michael Hayden at the Federal Building in Chicago. And there was a pretty substantial shift in his rhetoric after that. In the CIA, they call that the holy shit brief, because they say that every incoming president uses the phrase holy shit once the CIA briefs them about the sort of enormousness of the threats facing the country. And it's intended to be that, because we have two governments in this country. One is elected every 4 years or every 2 years or every 6 years when it comes to senators and congresspeople and presidents. And then the other is never elected, and that is the permanent bureaucracy at the State Department, the CIA, the military. And that permanent bureaucracy can wait out any problematic elected official because of term limits, and they could say, well, he's going to be gone in a few years, so we'll like kind of just like sit in the sides for a little while. We'll let him think that he's reforming this or stopping this, but really we're running the game. And what they do then, once you become president, is they all come and they just inundate the new president with every possible threat that could hit the United States. This building might get blown up, this subway, this kind of gas, we're monitoring these people. If you don't, and it's like, and meanwhile Obama's like, well, I wanted to do healthcare and I want to do the economy. So he gets briefed early on, and he had campaigned on the idea that he wasn't going to do large-scale military invasions, but he was told by the heads of the military, special operations in the CIA, if you discontinue the high-value targeting campaign that was implemented by Cheney, Rumsfeld, Bush, the odds of us getting hit in the United States are going to dramatically increase. And so when he was asked, when he asked all of these people for sets of options, he selected the one that he believed was going to be the least politically problematic, but also result in the least number of American deaths, and would allow him to make an argument that this was a smarter way of waging war. And that was that he gave tremendous power to the military's Joint Special Operations Command, expanded their abilities to strike in more countries, began heavily relying on drone strikes, and then moving to pull troops out of Iraq. And I think that I think there was not like the generals threatened him, there was going to be a coup. I think that's how power works in this country. Who is actually going to say to all of the generals and all of the career intelligence personnel, thank you for your input, but I've decided that I'm not going to do any of that. Rahm Emanuel, who was his chief of staff at the time, who is a cynical bastard, was in on all these briefings. He was in on all the national security briefings, and Emanuel really didn't give a shit about any of this stuff. He cared about re-election. That was his entire job. That's what the political people, their goal immediately, once they win, is next term. And so he's looking at it, and his calculus is, how do these policies affect our chances of a re-election? And how does it affect our ability to get other domestic legislation passed and other agendas? So they essentially cut deals with the most hawkish individuals in the national security state, including on Capitol Hill. And I think that Obama really did believe that this was the least bad thing that he could do. And I think it'll be interesting when he actually, leaves office and some years down the line, see what direction he goes in, and if he ever actually addresses these issues. Because my guess would be that there are some serious reservations that he holds. We've just gotten no public indication that that's the case. But I do think that I do think it's just the nature of the beast and the overwhelming of a new president by the national security deep state.
I can't resist to ask a follow-up. Do you hear Larry Wilmore gave some comments at the Correspondents' Dinner a week or two ago, and he made a joke about raining down bombs and
like Steph Curry. Yeah, he said you and Steph Curry both rain bombs down on people. Yeah.
Okay, time for 2 more questions. So do you want to pick?
Well, I mean, the young man in the back there.
Good.
It's interesting. All of the people that say that Larry bombed at that were the journalists that he attacked. Everyone else thought he did a great job. So.
All right. I won't be like the American government. I'll ask because they don't care if I record.
Yeah.
All right, cool. I'll just, personal privacy.
No.
All right. So you speak a lot about targeted individuals and kill lists. I know you're not referring to them as I know personally, but there are a certain group of people who are targeted by the government for non-consensual human experimentation by these directed energy weapons. I personally interviewed former CIA engineer Dr. Robert Duncan. This is about a year ago. He's admitting that citizens are being tortured and targeted with these voice of God weapons, meaning you don't even have to have a microchip implant, you don't have to have any kind of nanotechnology in your body. So I'm wondering if I could give you his telephone number, a book about my personal experiences, since you're the only person who have the ethics, to stand on the side of right, even when, something seems so unbelievable. I mean, people who said the NSA was spying on them was considered mentally ill until Edward Snowden revealed the information.
Well, I actually get a lot of emails from people who are describing the kinds of experiences that you're describing, and I haven't researched it or looked into it. I do know that there are a lot of people that are saying similar things about that. So I can't give you an informed comment. If I could, I would. What I will say is that the idea that the United States, particularly the CIA, has conducted human experimentation for a very, very long time is real. And in Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, I think a lot of people wave off any discussion of the MK Ultra mind control program as sort of tinfoil hat conspiracy stuff. But if you read Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, and you understand the scholarly nature of this mad scientist lab that they were running, experimenting on human beings, it means that we should be asking questions about what the government is doing in terms of its manipulation of the human body and the human mind. I also think that because we live in a hyper-surveillance state now, and we live in a society totally shrouded in secrecy, that all of us have a right to ask and to be told what kinds of surveillance is being done on us, and that's what we're trying to do. But to the specific experience you're describing, I don't know, but I do know that there is a long history of this country experimenting on people. You look at the Tuskegee experiment. They infected people with syphilis. without telling them. Smallpox against Native Americans in this country. Their own record makes it so that they should have to answer questions about all of these things that they, that they're doing with U.S. taxpayer dollars. But I don't know about the specific thing that you're describing, but I do know that there's a long history of the CIA experimenting on people. Okay, go ahead.
Thanks for coming, Jeremy. I have a question about the companies and contractors that facilitate targeted assassinations. Do you see them as being immune to public pressure campaigns and divestment campaigns?
Well, if you go online and you watch any of the ads for Lockheed Martin, for instance, I mean, those are really the kind of top-tier, crazy sort of celebrations of American privatized militarism. They're very sophisticated. You feel like you're watching the trailer to the next awesome blow shit up movie. And Lockheed Martin is basically a wing of the United States military. And its personnel populate every single aspect of national security policy. In fact, I'll tell you just one sort of personal interaction I had. Bob Grenier, who was the former head of the CIA's counterterrorism center, he was the chief of station at the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad on 9/11, and then he went on to become the head of the whole counterterrorism center. And he and I were doing an event together once, and he told me that when he first got to Langley to run this division, that he was going around and introducing himself to all of the heads of various departments that were working on the high-value targeting program and everything. And he said that multiple people, when he would introduce themselves, would hand them a business card. I mean, these were people running divisions of the CIA, and they would hand him a Lockheed Martin or a Boeing business card, saying, well, they weren't employees of the federal government, but they were running whole aspects of this program. The fact is that the politicians who represent the districts where these companies are from. I mean, you all know the story here with Boeing and other corporations. They will never stand up against those companies. The people that would be in charge of overseeing them are funded by them. And you're asking a question about divestment and pressure. I think that the war industry in general is largely immune to any public targeting because the people who are supposed to be overseeing it receive huge campaign contributions. I mean, I've long thought that when people are elected to Congress, they should have to wear suits that have the logos of all the companies that finance their campaigns, like NASCAR drivers, so that we have an understanding when you vote against this or for this. Okay, well, it makes sense, because they actually got the prime real estate, on your lapel. I think in some cases it has, in the case of Blackwater, for instance, I do think that there was so much public pressure that Congress sort of was forced to do something. That's something that they did largely failed. It only succeeded in getting Blackwater to change its name, basically. And Eric Prince is very much in business. We've been writing about him recently. But no, I mean, I think when activists have tried to target directly these companies, and war is business, and business is fantastic right now, and so I think it's kind of ends up being a fool's errand to go after the companies, even though I think they should be gone after. I think it's a more strategic campaign to go after the politicians that are the main defenders of those corporations. If we don't get money, I mean, this is one thing that I passionately agree with Bernie Sanders about. If we do not get huge corporate money out of our politics, nothing will ever fundamentally change in this country. Nothing, no matter what issue any of us consider our most important issue. I don't care what it is. You could shout it out, and I guarantee you this applies to it. If you don't get corporations out of the electoral process, none of those issues are going to be tackled in any meaningful way if they come up against corporate pushback. And that's the way it is in this country. There was a coup a long time ago, and it wasn't a violent coup at all. It was an information and a corporate coup, where we were groomed to start to believe that what happens in the Kardashian household is reality, and what happens in Baghdad and Mogadishu and elsewhere is not our business, or nothing that we have to pay attention to. I'm happy to sign books, but I'll leave you with this one quote from one of the best movies I think that's ever been made, which is the movie The Usual Suspects. Kevin Spacey's character at the end of that film says the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. And that's really how powerful coups happen. Doesn't require generals taking over. It happens when you don't even realize it's happening. And then you wake up one day and you say, how did we all become tethered to these electronic devices and obsessed with the lives of people that we can't even tell you why they're celebrities? And so going after these companies would be great, but their enablers in Congress are the ones that actually make it all possible. It's government incorporated. Anyway, thank you guys very much. I'm happy to talk and sign books and everything.